Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon, Revolutionizing the Principalship, Bold Bets to Elevate School Leadership. I am going to give folks just a couple moments to log on and get settled, and then we will hop right in. Okay, it looks like we are all ready. So once again, for anyone that joined just a few seconds late, welcome. I'm Lorén Cox. I am the Policy Director for the Education and Society program here at the Aspen Institute. Today, I'm so excited to release and have a discussion about our most recent paper, Revolutionizing the Principalship. And I'll be here presenting today with my co-author, Megan Bennett, who is also my colleague here at Aspen. She will share a bit about the paper, and then we'll have an opportunity later in the session to have a panel discussion with some guests that we will introduce at that moment at later on in the webinar as well. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about just who we are at Aspen. And so at Aspen, we work to inform, influence, and inspire education leaders across both policy and practice. We do that with a real emphasis on achieving equity for students of color and students through from low-income families. And we do that in a variety of ways. We have the honor of running a number of networks of education leaders kind of throughout the education ecosystem. We also have the opportunity to support folks on the ground through thought leadership and other technical assistance, but with the goal that we can really create leaders, systems, schools that create the most opportunity for every student that's enrolled in public school. A few years back, we took a step back to think about what is it that grounds our work here at Education and Society. And we put out a publication called We Are What We Teach. And in that, we state that we believe there are three foundational purposes of public education. One is to develop a healthy sense of self. We want students to be in environments where they can feel confident about themselves, where they feel cared for, where they feel like what they're learning and experiencing reflects their own life experience. We also want students to be prepared to effectively engage in American democracy, in their community, and in civic life. And then there's a recognition that no matter what path any student takes, eventually almost all of us work. And so we want to make sure that they are prepared for the future of work so that they can have meaningful careers. And so that kind of guides all of the different work that we do here at Aspen, whether it be on the policy side of the house or the practitioner side of the house. And that is also what has helped informed our journey around the principalship and how we've been thinking about it over the last couple of years. The paper that we'll be talking about today is the third in a series of three papers. The first one was Rethinking the Role of the Principal, and it really outlined 6 school and district level shifts to make for the principalship so that it could be a more impactful but also sustainable role. The second paper that was released by my colleagues, one who you'll hear from later, Jean, really looked at how 5 districts and states are empowering principals to focus on leadership so that they can think about positive school climates and delivering rigorous academic experiences and opportunities for every student. But understanding that there can be shifts that need to be made, there are practices that need to happen on the ground. There are also changes just to the role to make it a positive experience for the school leader. We wanted to think about what are some of the policy shifts that could help create the conditions that we want to see. And so that is what led into this paper. I will name up front that this paper is about what are some ideas that we think could make a big change in the field. Some of them we may have examples of where things are starting to happen in the field, and admittedly, some of them may be untested, but it's meant to push us to think about how do we really highlight this role that we know is so important to kids and make sure that school leaders are supported in the work that they do so it's leading to the outcomes that we want for every student. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Megan to take us through the paper.
Thank you so much, Lorén. As Lorén noted, this is the third paper in a series of papers where we're really applying a policy lens to what innovative solutions we're going to bring about the role of the principal that were envisioned in the first two papers. Now, the first question might be, why are we focusing on principals as a policy lever? Now, they're one individual in a school, but they've been shown to have an incredible impact on the overall success of the school. A Wallace report that came out in 2021 noted that the impact of replacing a below average principal with an above average principal actually added almost an additional 3 months of learning for both math and reading for students in that school year. And to note, this report compared other interventions for math and reading and saw that just replacing a principal, a low performing principal with an above average principal, actually was more effective than 2/3 of the math interventions they tried and 1/2 of the reading interventions. So while it's only one person in a school, we believe they have an outsized impact to actually help bring about the revolution that we were thinking about in education. So while we know that principals can be a linchpin for educational transformation, current principal policies really still think of a limited scope when we think about the role of the principal. They really don't fully recognize principals' influence or adequately prepare principals for the type of leaders they need to be within their school and within their communities. So while we are thinking about, there have already been innovations happening in the field, and while we've looked at what schools and districts in other countries have done, we're really pushing for bold solutions. As Lorén set up, these don't necessarily have a direct correlation with of innovations that have happened on the ground, but we're looking to catalyze a paradigm shift in how we think of school leadership. And so we are really thinking about bold bets and not incrementalism. So here are the 5 bets that we thought about after talking to school, to district, and to state leaders. We don't think these are the only innovations that can happen in principal policy, but we think these are bold steps that can be made to reframe the role of the principal to the vision that we want. The 5 bets are: first, reimagining principal preparation through a West Point model. Second, launching principal state policy implementation boards. Third, creating a mandatory director of operations role at each school. Fourth, fostering data-driven leadership by creating data camps for principals. And fifth, by transforming principal licensure. I'm now going to go into what we mean by each one of these bold bets to give you a better understanding of where we're coming from. So the first bet, again, is reimagining principal preparation through a West Point model. We know that current principal preparation can really vary from context to context, but what we know across all these contexts is that they don't often think about how vast the role of the principal is and what are the main real levers that principals need to know to accomplish what they need to be the leaders they need to be. They're often narrowly focused, but we know principals need to know organizational leadership. They need to understand human development, and they even need to understand policy implementation. We also know that by programs varying widely, sometimes attendance is actually predicated on people who want to have raises to their pay scale and aren't necessarily looking to be school leaders. And we also recognize that that means that when we think of principal preparation, we aren't having it to the height and the rigor that we need for the actual amount that this role is really important in the school. So we're asking for each state to think about opening in their flagship universities a West Point model for principal preparation. This would identify the top performing candidates who demonstrate excellence in the classroom, a propensity for leadership, and a commitment to continuous learning. Now, this idea didn't come out of nowhere. We looked across how other countries have elevated school leaders and teachers, and looked at places like Singapore, who made it incredibly rigorous to be able to even get into teacher prep and principal prep programs, with the idea of elevating the prestige of the role of school leaders in their country. And so we'd want this program to have a comprehensive curriculum that's not just focused on education, but really focused on all the different leadership skills a school leader needs. It would be highly selective, but we'd also hope to make sure we're not creating barriers to entry by making it tuition free for those candidates that are committed to becoming a principal. We hope by creating this model that we'd be able to develop exceptional school leaders, create a sustainable pipeline of leaders that we know come from a high quality program, but overall actually elevate the prestige of the principalship, because we know how important school leaders are in schools, but we want to make sure we are elevating that throughout the country. Oops, sorry. The second policy we're looking to launch is launching principal state policy implementation boards. One of the biggest frustrations we hear in the education policy process is often that the policies, the idea behind the policy doesn't actually come to fruition through implementation. And that's often because of a breakdown in communication by people who are actually within the school and people who are working in policy. We want to make sure that as policies are implemented, that that folks don't feel a whiplash effect, that they don't feel like they're getting policy after policy after policy at the school level and have to implement but cannot implement with fidelity because they're constantly changing. We also want to make sure that the policies that are being expressed in policies that are being brought down to schools actually are feasible from a school level. So we are proposing that states create a state principal policy implementation board. This is not a completely new idea. We actually saw North Carolina a few years ago bring together principals to advise on school summer camps, and it actually helped increase the ability for these camps to be successful from the lever of having practitioner input in the process. Where we're asking states at the state level to actually bring together a board that would consist of current and former school leaders from diverse districts. These principals would be trained on how to understand and read the policy, and then they would apply an implementation score on the feasibility of this from the lens of a school leader. We believe that this would help in two ways, that the policymakers would gain insights from practitioners and understand the realities on the ground, but also would increase the likelihood that these policies would be implemented with fidelity, that they'd have buy-in from a group of principals already before the policy is enacted, and it would, again, be more feasible and feel less likely that it would there would be pendulum swings in how implementation happens because there would be advice from practitioners at the front end. The third big bet we are looking for is a mandatory director of operation role. A few years ago, Calder came out with a study of how principals typically spend their time, and they noted that most principals spend their time on things like operational, administrative, and managerial duties, but only a smaller amount of time on internal relations with students and staff, and even less time on community relations. Now we know how we want to rethink the role of the principal is that they're not just building managers, but they're true transformational leaders. We've seen places like DC Public Schools create opportunities for an optional use of funds to create a director of operations role that really will reduce the operational burden on principals and allow principals to focus on things like instructional leadership, on cultivating school climate, and cultivating community relations. But we want to take it a step further and mandate this role so it is funded for every school, so that we are really rethinking how principals are showing up in school really as instructional leaders and as school climate leaders and not just building managers. The next big bet we're looking to do is a data camp for principals. We know that education ecosystem is incredibly data rich. We know that principals have access to state and federal assessment data, to administrative records, to school climate surveys, and even opportunity to learn metrics. But oftentimes principal preparation don't actually help them understand how to collect, how to understand and analyze, and then how to use the data that's available to them to actually make improvements in the school. So we are pushing for states to create data camps as professional development for principals. These would be specifically tailored to principals and understand the state context. Like, what are the state exams? What are the assessments? What's the specific policy context or specific data context that principals operate in? Part of the reason we're asking for this to be continuous professional development or have camps for this yearly is because the data environment can change from year to year. Even if this is embedded in principal preparation, the data might shift. There might be a new assessment that they have access to. There might be new data available. So you really want to think about data-driven leadership as a continuous learning model so that principals are always able to, again, understand what data is available to them, understand how to analyze it, but then also apply this data and this learning to effectively allocate resources and implement targeted interventions to support students and their success. The final big bet is transforming principal licensure. This is not a new idea, and I know there's been many attempts to try to understand or fix licensure. But where we stand now is oftentimes principal licensure exams do not passing the exam does not predict future success of school leaders. And even worse, these exams can sustain inequities in access and opportunity without offering the tangible value of identifying promising school leaders. So as we've discussed this idea of principal licensure with school leaders, with district leaders, and with state leaders, we came up with 4 big buckets that we think need to shift in principal licensure so that we can make sure what principals are being tested on is actually consistent with the reality of being a school leader. The first is making sure it's aligned with prioritized leadership standards. Now, states can set standards, but one of the big pushes that we've heard from the first 2 principal papers that our K-12 leadership program put out is that the standards really need to be aligned to be research-based, and they have to be specific. You can't just stack every single possible thing that has to happen in a school on a principal's plate. You have to really think about what are the standards for leadership that is really going to align with the best outcomes for schools and students. Second is that principal licensure can get stagnant. We know that the ecosystem of schools can change from year to year, but policy might not keep up. So putting in a mechanism for continuous stakeholder evaluation and improvement so that you're hearing from school leaders, you're hearing from teachers, you're even hearing from parents and students about what they need out of their what principals are in their schools will help make sure that licensure doesn't become stagnant and that it is responsive to the school context of the moment. The next is performance-based assessment. Really, right now, we know that a principal's day-to-day life is not sitting down and taking a test. It's being interactive with the school, understanding those interpersonal connections, and being able to actually operate within a classroom and within a school environment. So pushing to have more of the principal licensure include things such as case studies, such as reenactments, or even things like apprenticeship. We see a shift towards wanting more of this hands-on experience from school leaders by seeing like the Department of Labor now opening their apprenticeship program for principals to be able to be part of it. So really thinking about how we bring performance-based assessment into the licensure process. And connected with that is the last bucket, which is transparent criteria and multiple measures. So we want to make sure that if a candidate's coming in, they know what they're going to be graded on so that we're not restricting the access to potential candidates who could be great leaders, and that they're not just taking one exam, that it's an exam and a performance-based assessment, an exam and some other level of assessment to make sure that they're a more holistic way to understand how to license school leaders. Now, we understand that was a very fast overview of the 5 big bets. I love for everyone to go into our paper and explore more of the nuance to what we are thinking about these, but we really do think these 5 big bets are a bold step states can make to really show that they care about the role of the principal and that it should be empowering a principal to be a great school leader. Now, I'm really excited to turn it back to Lorén so we can hear from our panelists about how they're thinking about innovation in the role of the principal and how these 5 big bets could help.
Thank you, Megan. I really appreciate you taking us through the paper. And while I love getting the opportunity to share our thoughts, I am really excited to hear from folks who do this work every day or support this work or have a long history of doing it in their career. So really looking forward to our panel conversation. We do have 3 panelists with us. We are joined by Angelica Infante Green, who's the Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education for the state of Rhode Island. We are also joined by Stacy Limelin, who's the principal at Meadowlark Elementary School in Billings, Montana. Stacy was also named Distinguished Principal of the Year by the National Association of Elementary School Principals. And our third panelist is Gene Pinkard, who I am honored to have as a colleague here at Aspen. He is currently the director of our K-12 leadership program, but has worn many hats from being a principal to being a principal leader and also being in leadership at DCPS. So I would like to welcome all of our panelists and just say I'm excited to kick off our conversation. I am going to ask each of you some questions, but for the audience, I encourage you to put some questions in the Q&A function. We are going to go to those after our initial discussion, and so want to hear what you're thinking about and hear if you have questions either for the panelists or the Aspen team. And please do use the Q&A function rather than the chat to push those forward. So welcome again. And Angelica, I would love to start with you, if you don't mind. You also have worn many hats in ways and have a real emphasis on how you think about supporting school leaders. And so as leading your state, I know that you have to think about implementation, you have to think about support, but also knowing that you're kind of driving all policies and practices to the outcomes that you want for kids. And so I'm wondering from your perspective, kind of what's the most essential qualities and supports that you hear from principals that they need right now to be those transformational leaders? And how are some of the things that you have been trying out working, and how do they align with the big bets in this paper?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I hear from our principals is really wanting the support, and you said it there, is implementing some of the policy and in having a say in the policy. So they really want to be able to have those conversations with us, to be able to help us put out the guidance, and we are very thoughtful about doing that. We have made very big changes in our secondary regs, and our principals and our superintendents have been part of those changes. Because many times people like me or my organization, we think about big scope across the board, and then how it gets carried out is really important, because we don't want policy for the sake of policy, but to actually enact change. And I think that that is a different frame. And one of the things that we heard from our principals was that operation piece, really removing that as part of their everyday and having that support. And that's something that we, during the pandemic, did, is that we created those operational roles for all of our principals so they can really focus on their development and leadership, but also on really moving the instructional agenda in their buildings. And we found that they had a hard time really felt pulled in the day-to-day and the operational piece. So for us, it was really important for us to really think about apprenticeship as being a key lever as we drive this agenda forward. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that we put in place as we go on in our talk here today.
Great. Thank you so much. And so, Stacy, I would love to come to you. You are a principal with a track record of success. As I said earlier, you were named as the National Distinguished Principal of the Year. And so I'm wondering, what are the conditions that are needed to really help you and other principals thrive? And if any of these bold belts can help in creating those conditions from your perspective.
Well, hello, and thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it. As I thought about these bold bets, even thinking about conditions that make my jobs, successful, the three things that really came to the top are time and knowledge and connections. And, in looking at all of those, time is such a huge thing. I need time as a building principal to be able to help implement curriculum, instruction, to be able to coach, to be able to walk through, spend time in the classrooms with the teachers, with the students, looking at success criteria, looking at learning intentions, be able to, just be present. We know that a principal being present, being visible, being part of the classroom, there's research out there that shows that the schools are going to be more successful. So when a school principal is locked in their office doing paperwork or trying to do building operation type things that are keeping us out of our classrooms, it can really hinder what's happening in the building. And that is probably the biggest challenge. I swear there's a time warp that happens. I'm headed down the hallway and suddenly I have not made it to all the places I've gone to. And I think, gosh, where did my time go? And it was on a lot of little things. So, thinking about a building operation manager position, something like that would would be revolutionary, I think. And I think that would be something that I don't think people have really thought about that. That's a huge, bold bet. I love the thought of that. I think that having those two different roles in a building could really change the outcome of what's happening in our buildings and really help propel us even further. And so that is my goal every day. My goal every day is to be in those classrooms, to be with the kids and the teachers, and yet something often sucks me back into my office or into the office area. And so I think that's really, really important. I also, I talk about knowledge. Principals need to come into this profession with confidence to lead and being able to understand the job ahead of them. And there's so many different ways now to get your credentials to be a principal that as I watch my younger colleagues, it's just pretty vast. And so I think that would be, having like that West Point model or having that flagship university in each of the states have a program that is really comprehensive and rigorous, and that we're all coming in with a lot of the same knowledge instead of the thought that we're just going to drink out of a fire hose in order to learn our job would be so important. And then last but not least, I really believe connections with our stakeholders, whether it's our parents, our legislators, that is huge for a principal. And I often say things like, how do I get on that board in Helena? Helena is where our legislature meets. And I'll ask people, how do I get onto the education board? How do I get onto that policy board? And people will chuckle and say things like, well, you have to make friends with the governor. And well, that's not necessarily reality as far as do I have time to do that? But also there needs to be a voice for education from the leadership perspective from our principals. And so having that board of principals that could actually be there helping policy be made would, again, propel our education system just forward, because you have to have the people who are boots on the ground and have that knowledge base working with the people who are making the policies. So all of those things go together to make the conditions to make a successful education system and schools. And I'm excited about all of the things that you have in your paper.
Thank you, Stacy. I really appreciate it. And Jean, so you, like I shared at the beginning, I know you've worn lots of hats, including being an author on the first two papers of this series. And so I'm wondering, when you think about the bold bets that we've put here, what is the connection between what we've put as policy bets to the shifts or the supports that you've heard from principals and districts about what they need to see from their school leaders?
Sure. Thanks for asking that. And thanks for the opportunity to work with you in this space, even though we're in the same space every day. The first connection is that we tried to root our initial papers in the research on, and so Megan mentioned research from the Wallace Foundation on the impact of principals, and we complement that or couple that with the research on the science of learning and development and the research on how educators actually lead their communities most effectively. And what we found is that the research is often ahead of where policy stands or where traditional practices exist, or it puts a finer point, to Stacy's point, the research puts a finer point on where she wants to spend her time as an instructional leader, as a leader in the community, versus where she sometimes has to spend her time because of operational issues. And so the bold bets are ways, I think, to effectively codify and build structures so that Stacy can do the work that only Stacy can do as an instructional leader, as the person in the building who has the broad scope of what her community needs, as well as what the district wants to happen. You have to build structures for her to be able to lean into those spaces. The second connection that I would make is that the education ecosystem is complex and there are a lot of actors. And if we rely on principals to just get it right, then the best that we're going to give them is some information where they're swimming against a tide. Or if Angelica designs really thoughtful policies, as she often does, but we haven't actually given school leaders the new information about the why behind that, given them the skill set to be data-driven leaders and have stronger analysis of a complex data set. Then you're moving one part of the ecosystem forward and leaving the other part behind. And so I just think your paper, Lorén and Megan, is one that really clarifies for people the so what, now what piece of this. There are important research foundations, there are great ideas, but we've got to actually build them into multiple tiers of the ecosystem if we want that to take effect.
Thanks, Jean. And I would love to just follow up on some of the things that I heard. So Stacy, you frame this as time, knowledge, and connections. I am mindful that each of the things we've listed take a lot of time, including something like an implementation board. And Angelica, you talked at the top about how you have been really intentional at making sure that school leaders are part of the process as you design this. I'm wondering if you could share what has that process looked like and how have you helped structure it in a way that school leaders have the time to do the instructional leadership that we know they need to do while also being kind of hand in hand as you all think about policies to support them.
Yeah, I'll get started. So I think for me, the most important part is as we start developing policy, what is policy for, right? It is obviously to continue and to further the education system, but we're either trying to solve a problem or we're trying to support what's happening in the school system. So as we do that, we bring our stakeholders to the table. And because we know how important the principal is to moving the agenda in the classrooms, in the school buildings, they are part of those conversations. As we start building out our policy, they're part of it every step of the way. And then the second piece that we think is really important is how do we actually implement that? And one of the things that your paper was also very clear on is how do you measure, who's a good leader? So having that front and center, and for us, it was really important to invest some of our funding to support our future leaders. And we have something called RIRAP. I know it sounds weird, but it's Rhode Island Register Apprenticeship Principal Program. So we invest in really being on the ground, having them learn and being very clear about what the research says, what they're going to be rated on, and what makes the most impact in the school building. And we've taken our money and we've really worked with an organization in our system that is going to help our principals and our assistant principals really look at what's required for a principal and some of the things that we put in place that we think are important based on research and the things that we see have moved the agenda. And we've really worked with some of our local leaders, principals, that have had an impact to help inform some of that work. And that for us is really, really important. Anytime we put out any policy, there's a period where we work with the community and the principals are part of that community to really enact it. And then there's the guidance that goes along. And so as we move along, we learned, especially during the pandemic, just what Stacy said, that the day-to-day stops you from getting into the classroom, from having those connections, from meeting with the community, the day-to-day operational piece. So we have really brought it together to understand the importance, but also making it somebody else's responsibility. So you're not doing all those day-to-day that hinders you from going into the classroom. So, and having a very clear rubric of what that looks like has been really important for us. And, I'll give you the 4 domains that we are using because I think it's really important. Domain 1 is mission, vision, and goals. Domain 2, which should be really 1, is teaching and learning. Domain 3 is organizational systems, and then community. Those are the things that principals really want to spend their time doing. And these are the things that we are putting in place, and our principals are very clear on. This is how we're going to move our system forward.
Thank you. And Stacy, we've heard a lot about preparation. One of the bets is like, how do you do a different type of model and an acknowledgement that there can be variation. I also think there's an acknowledgement of just things change over time. Certainly in the pandemic, people were asked to do things that no one could prepare them for. And so, in sitting at your seat, knowing that you have got to build policies and practices at the school level that have been great for kids. What are the things, if we went after the West Point model, what are some of the things that you really wish the preparation would focus on that either we didn't before or has changed? There could be any reason why someone did not receive that, but that you think should be prioritized moving forward.
Oh gosh. That's a big question. So I think that I'm going to loop back to what Angelica just said, though. Our district just started a apprentice program in our district. They started with anyone who was interested or, had some goals of being an administrator and bringing them into they did a year-long class and then have them in buildings right now, working with administrators, just learning the job. And I think that we are seeing huge success with that right now because prior to that, I was a classroom teacher. I applied to be a principal. I got the job. I was a principal the next day and in the building. And I had my only experience in that was that I watched what my principal did, right? And so we are seeing some real success with having these educational leaders, these up and coming principals in this program. And it's really, I think, going to be so successful. I think that what they're learning right now that they didn't understand probably before this is they didn't understand that you don't get to walk in the door and just be an instructional leader, even though that is our goal. Our goal is to go be an instructional leader. And that is not what happens. And so we've had to learn. I think our principals are getting to learn, we have a crisis of behaviors happening with students. We have all kinds of emotional things happening. And so getting that background knowledge and even getting some education right now on just student behaviors, on how to manage, how to communicate, how to build relationships with parents and do all those things. I think that's what these programs are really strong in or are helping with at this point. I mean, we have a long ways to go. I think having that strong rubric and all of the things that, all of our goals for that are helping our district anyhow move forward in this area. And I feel like I didn't answer all of that, but.
Oh, that's great. Jean, I'm probably going to ask you another big question. One of the big bold bets here is around data camps. And I think the idea being that the better that you can work with data, the more likely you are to both decide what the right intervention is for a set of students or for a school, as well as be able to measure progress over time. I know that you've been in the role of having to support several principals, the principals in the district. And so I'm wondering what role you've seen data play, and how it could be improved through something like a data camp.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and I loved the way that you all structured this idea. When a long time ago, when I was a principal, we were still using Excel, and then we had conditional formatting, so we had red, yellow, and green, and finding the bubble kids, etc. And things have changed a lot. And so the tools at our disposal will do a significant amount of analysis for us. And what has also evolved is that we know a lot more about the complexity of the little humans in our schools and all the indicators that matter, whether it's climate indicators or school performance or belonging and student satisfaction surveys and family data and community data and economic data. And so there are better analytical tools and there is more data, which actually elevates what's demanded of principals. because now I really appreciated the example in Indiana in the paper of I forget exactly what their program is called, but their sort of data curriculum that they have accessible to principals, because it helps you not only with analyzing data to see what it says. The next thing that a principal has to do is the now what. What does this mean for our school? What does it mean for professional learning? What does it mean for how we allocate intervention resources or our tutoring programs? It also has significant implications for the principal on communication, how you tell a story with the data, how do you cater it to your audience, how do you visualize the data to help motivate a community around the work that needs to be done, and also celebrate all that's been accomplished. These are the things that are the nature of leadership. And so data camps aren't just about let's unpack our scores on the last state test. That is part of it. But there's so much more depth, nuance, and complexity into what's expected and needed in the school leadership role, that it's that having a policy, having a structure that's supported so a principal doesn't have to figure this stuff out all by themselves. And on that last note of the solitude of it, being able to be in conversation with other school leaders about what they're seeing, what the trends they're seeing, and what strategies they're adopting is another benefit of having that kind of data learning and support.
Thank you. And I know that we've seen this I mean, to your point that we just know so much more about little people, we do just know so much more about people. And so we've seen this shift across a number of service agencies that work with the public about how to better prepare employees kind of at every level on how to interact with the data and make decisions about how to best support whoever it is, whether a little person or a grown-up in front of you. We are getting quite a few questions in the chat, and so I want to thank our panelists for your initial thoughts on those kind of pointed questions to each of you, but I am going to shift us to what our audience wants to hear about. Some of them are going to be specific follow-ups, but I encourage each of you to kind of hop in if there's one that you have a thought about. But to kick us off, Angelica, I am going to start with you because there's a couple questions around this manager of operations and how you make it work from a financial standpoint. And specific, like I think there's a general question with strained budgets, what does that look like? And then also knowing that the ESSER kind of fiscal cliff is approaching, how do you see this moving forward, both in Rhode Island, but for other folks who may be thinking about it as well?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely put it in place during the pandemic because we had the money, but we're making decisions, right? We have student-based budgeting and school-based budgeting. So the principals are going to be making the decisions whether they keep those positions or not. And many of the principals have selected to keep those positions because they really saw the value in them. And I think that is the hard part. Do you give up an AP position? What do you do? But once they have seen the value of that, especially in the high schools, where it is, every day people are sort of moving very quickly, and many of our high schools are very large. So that position was very needed, where the principals could actually be the instructional leader, can actually have those conversations. So they're tough decisions. It's unfortunate that we all have to make that. But as we start thinking about what we're going to need for principals to be successful, I think that's a very strong component that we have to make a case for in all our schools.
Jean, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, we had a role similar to that at a couple of the schools that I ran. And I was in a larger district and larger schools at times, which gave us the flexibility and the student-based funding to create that position. Many of the schools that we see now here looking at from Aspen at the national landscape don't necessarily have the same resources. And so one approach that we've seen is where districts support that by creating a hotline function around some of these operational issues that Stacy mentioned earlier, so that we can minimize if she's walking down the hall to, take a look at what was you said, like the learning intentions data, and have that conversation, and somebody says, why is it hot on the third floor? minimize the amount of time that she has to spend responding to that if she's got a centralized service that can take that off of the plates of school leaders in their buildings.
And then, Jean, you kind of started to talk about this in your answer around data, but would open it up for everyone from the seats that you sit in. One of the questions is like, what data might be used to measure principals and school success? Are we talking about moving away from standardized testing, or are we talking about moving towards more holistic data that also talks about students' confidence and well-being, school climate? And so just wondering what each of you think that could and should look like. And Jean, you brought it up first, so I'll go to you, but then would like to hear from each of you.
Sure, you hit some of them on the head. If students don't feel a sense of belonging, if they don't feel like people see them as intellectually capable, and these are questions that we can ask students, and the research tells us that they will tell us the truth. The research tells us that their answers on this are predictive of how they'll do not only in school, but further on. So student survey data is really valuable both on climate and their personal experience. I would also say faculty data. We know that when we see turnover in schools and school systems, and really in any organization, one of the top drivers of retention or turnover is folks' interaction and quality of interaction with their supervisors. And so I think these are things that we want to have on the table when a principal supervisor is having a conversation with their principal. When I was in either of those seats, that's not just fair game, it's actually critical to being able to do the job well.
Stacy, I'm wondering if you had
Well,
here.
yeah, I'm not going to lie. When the thought of, or when we first started talking about doing climate and culture surveys, I was scared to death of them as a principal, because I felt like it was a self-reflection, right? And I needed to be able to dive in and do those. And so, but we have implemented in the last few years both community, student, and staff surveys, and that we dive into. We do them twice a year. I would like to do them 3 times a year, but twice a year right now is working. And so we dive into those, and we've really been able to take some useful data away to propel our school. And part of that is when I see that I have one staff member who's responding that they don't feel connected, they don't feel respected or involved, or different things like that. I wasn't aware of that. So I needed to go figure out I needed to figure that out. I needed to and figure out where we were falling down in that measure. Or when I have students say that they don't feel safe in a certain part of the school, or I have parents that feel like that they're not connected. Or on the opposite end, we get to celebrate when our parents are celebrating us with all the good things that we're seeing on those surveys. So it has ended up to be one of the most useful tools. And really, I feel like it should be my evaluation tool when I sit down with my supervisor, because that everything is in those climate and culture surveys, everything. I mean, it talks the academics, how the teachers care for the kids, everything that we do is wrapped up in those surveys. And I just have found it to be such an invaluable tool. And I wish I would have embraced it sooner than I did.
That's great. So I'll add that we have a survey that goes out statewide, and it's called SurveyWorks. And it really, it's not that we're not looking at the assessments as a rating tool, but we have these domains that I shared before, but also our SurveyWorks. So it is a student survey, it is a staff survey, it is also parent survey. So it gives you a lot of data of how, what's happening in the school. Do they feel connected? Do they feel like they're being supported? What are the parents experiencing? And that's part of the data that we collect, that they use to really look at how they move their school building forward. It is actually really powerful information. And it is what every one of our principals, we have a contest every year who gets 100% participation in all levels, and getting parents to participate, 100% of them, is a big deal. And we have many districts and school buildings that have that, and they use that information and they set those targets each year to keep moving forward.
Thank you. And I'll answer also from the Aspen perspective about, like, is it a move away from standardized testing and towards something different? I think the way that we see it is it's both. The research supports that you have to be going after rigorous academic preparation as well as supporting the more holistic, like, well-being and school climate, and that those things are interdependent on one another. So you can't say, I'm going to get everyone to read and then I'm going to make them feel like they belong, or the reverse. You have to be going after those things simultaneously for students to have the best experience and outcomes. And so I think it's more of a push of how do you look at it all together to understand what's happening in your schools and what interventions you should be focusing on as a school, as a district, as a state. And we kind of reject this binary choice between the two different types of data that you often hear about. There are several questions kind of around preparation. If I'm a teacher that wants to be a principal, what should I be looking at? And so I'm going to try to think about one set of questions that addresses many of those questions. Angelica, I would love to start with you to hear more about your apprenticeship model, because I think that's one pathway forward, and then could come back to Jean and Stacy for other ideas about what should folks that are sitting in AP roles or sitting in teacher roles be thinking about, as well as the folks that are building those programs and how to best prepare school leaders?
Yeah, I think Stacy was talking earlier about, you sort of in that role automatically, and you sort of learn trial by fire, but that's not what we want to do. We want people to actually have a pathway, some sort of direction, so that they can be successful, because it is a very lonely and very difficult job. So I mentioned before, we have an apprenticeship model for APs. If you want to be an AP, you go into this apprenticeship model that will lead you into a principalship. And we've dedicated state dollars to do that with. We're working with an organization locally called CLE, where they ground a lot of the work around setting direction, vision, with your leadership community. That is really important. Even though you might be a teacher, you don't know why big decisions are being made. And I think those things are really important, and really about honing in your teaching practice. People pay attention to those things, and how you get involved in decision making in the school. If you have school leadership team, if you have all those things in your building, please get involved if you want to have that pathway. But for us, it's been really important to have these 6 core leadership practices, which is setting direction, vision, and leadership, monitoring progress and sustaining momentum in your efforts. And that's something you can do in the classroom, right? Build capacity to teach, build capacity to collaborate. That's a really important skill that you need to have, is that collaboration. And leading for everyone in your learning community. How do you bring people together? How do you move the system? And then really systems to accelerate equity in your learning community. And I know equity is it's like a third rail right now, but it's really important that all the kids in your building can see progress. And I mentioned some of the data. You can look at that data. You can really and express your interest and work with your AP or your principal and talk about how those things can happen. But if there is an apprenticeship program wherever you are, I would take advantage of that, because you will see the day-to-day. You will be part of the decision making. You'll see how that takes part. And that's why we thought it was really important that you learn on the job. And if it doesn't exist, find other opportunities that already exist within your system.
Angelica, someone asked, could you name the organization again that you're working with on the apprenticeships?
Yes, it's called CLE.
Thank you. Stacy or Jean, anything to add on, like, what should that preparation look like, or what should folks be focusing on if being a school leader is something they're interested in?
Well, I agree. Being a leader in your building, If you have MTSS teams, if you have, during your PLC time, being a leader within your grade level, volunteering, I think that's such a big thing. So I know we're busy in this world. We are so busy. And sometimes I see a drop off with my staff on just even participating in things that like my PTA puts on. Well, that's part of your job as an elementary principal or as a principal, making sure you're in all of those activities. You're there at night, you're there with the parents. And so being a part of that, being visible, I think all of those things are important too. It kind of gives you a little bit of the taste of some of the things that you'll be involved in.
I'd agree with all that. I think the on-the-job prep is critical. I had the privilege of starting my career under a couple of amazing principals, and I shudder to think how things would have gone differently if I didn't have leaders like Stacy to show me the way. I would just add, if for folks who are looking at formal preparation programs, a graduate program or a credentialing program, that they're taking a look at who are the best leaders in our system, what are the values that we're actually committed to, and do those programs, are they current on the research? Do they align with what we see great leaders doing? Because that formal training or those credential programs are also going to be an important part, not just a paper that gets you in the door, but also part of what shapes your thinking as a leader.
Well, thank you all for that. I am going to do one last kind of whip around before we close it out, and it does come from our audience. It says, for each of you, are there any other big bets that you all would propose that are not in the paper, in terms of like what are strategies that you've seen that allow principals to be successful? If your answer is no, Lorén and Megan got it right, then you could just share any reflections that you have at the paper. But no, would love to close out with what are other things top of mind for you as we think about preparing the school leaders that we know are out there in the field and that we know kids need.
Yeah, I would say they got it right. Let's start off with that. But if you are looking for this opportunity, I would also go and shadow a principal in your district or somewhere else that you have seen that has made change, that, find them to be a mentor, to have conversations with why a decision's being made. That is possible. And in districts, really sharing those best practices really goes a long way.
Yeah. I think it's important that we become advocates, that we are advocating for education, that we're out there telling our stories, making sure that it's important that people know what's happening. They always say, if you don't tell your story, someone will make it up for you. And so not only, making sure that, but you need to advocate for education. You need to go out there and let people know that it is such a great profession and all of the great things that can come from it.
I'll build on what Stacy said and what Angelica said. Yes, Megan and Lorén did get it right. I would go deeper on the licensure big bet, because wherever you sit in the system, you are in the pipeline and you are responsible for the pipeline. And so licensure is sort of this formal credentialing conversation, but actually what's listed there in the paper, there are versions of that are about authentic learning experiences that you can create for yourself or others who are around you that move towards leadership positions and move towards being a principal.
Well, thank you all so much. We appreciate your just partnership in this work. To Stacy's point, the work of education that we kind of all sit at different levels at, but we're so grateful to get to do this work alongside many of you, and then grateful for the time that you gave for us today for this discussion. I do, before I close us completely out, we have a slide available that has a QR code to download the paper. We encourage you to hop into it. Send us your thoughts, send us your pushes. This is a body of work that the Aspen team is continuing to work on. And so we would love to hear about what's happening and how you think we can strengthen these proposals, as well as if you have follow-up questions, we're happy to engage in those conversations as well. Also, a shout out to our K-12 leadership team. I think on the next slide, yes, there is an upcoming webinar. It is on December 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I believe you can also scan that QR code, and it's about rethinking the principalships and some key considerations for states. And so I know you'd be hearing from our colleague Chelsea, and Jean, are you on that one as well? Chelsea. Okay. So you'd hear from our colleague Chelsea about that. So we invite you to consider continue the conversation with us, and we really appreciate your time today. There will be a recording of this presentation that will be available. We will send it out to all registered participants. It'll also be available on YouTube and on the Aspen website. So if there's any part that you missed, or if you want to share it with someone, we encourage you to do that. But otherwise, we thank you for your time, and thank you for all of the work that each of you do to support our schools and the work that we all need to be doing to make sure all kids have the opportunities they need to thrive. So thank you so much.